Imagine walking down a street lined with hundreds of shops. You pass a cafe you've never noticed before, and something about it feels familiar. You don't know why, but you feel a subtle warmth, an inexplicable attraction. You glance at it again the next day. The third time, you walk in and order a coffee. Something as simple as repeated exposure. Just seeing the cafe multiple times has shifted your perception, making you more comfortable, more trusting, and eventually, more attached. This is the essence of the mere exposure effect, a fascinating cognitive phenomenon that subtly shapes human preferences, decisions, and social behavior. Psychologists first described this effect in the 1960s, observing that people tend to develop a preference for things merely because they are familiar. The phenomenon has been studied in countless contexts, from words and faces to music, products, and even abstract symbols. The underlying principle is straightforward. Familiarity breeds liking, and yet, the implications are profound, influencing everything from marketing and politics to relationships and personal habits. Consider an experiment involving nonsense syllables or foreign words. Participants were exposed to certain words repeatedly and later asked to rate how much they liked them. Words they had seen more frequently consistently received higher ratings, even though participants had no conscious memory of the exposure. Their preference was shaped entirely by repetition, without deliberate reasoning or logic. This reveals the subtle power of familiarity. The mind equates repeated exposure with safety, comfort, and positive value. The mere exposure effect isn't limited to objects or words, it extends to people. In social psychology, studies show that the more frequently we encounter someone, the more likely we are to find them attractive or likable. This explains the common phenomenon of falling for someone you repeatedly see in your environment, a classmate, colleague, or neighbor. Our brains are wired to equate familiarity with trustworthiness and comfort, which is why repeated interaction fosters positive feelings, even in the absence of deeper knowledge. Marketers have long understood this principle. Ever notice how a brand suddenly starts feeling friendly or reliable after seeing repeated advertisements on social media, billboards, or TV? The brand isn't necessarily better than competitors, but the repeated exposure creates subconscious preference. Political campaigns exploit the same effect, saturating media channels with candidate images and slogans to make them feel familiar, likable, and trustworthy. The mere fact of exposure shapes perception. The effect can be powerful, but it also has limits. Too much repetition can trigger boredom or annoyance, a phenomenon psychologists call overexposure. There's a delicate balance, enough exposure to create familiarity and positive association, but not so much that it breeds irritation or fatigue. This is why well-crafted marketing campaigns rotate content, change visuals slightly, or stagger exposure over time to maintain engagement. The science behind the effect is rooted in evolutionary psychology. Humans evolved to respond positively to familiar stimuli because familiarity often signaled safety. Unfamiliar things, faces, sounds, environments, could indicate danger, so favoring what is familiar enhanced survival. Today, this mechanism still operates in our social and consumer choices, often without conscious awareness. Consider Emma, a young professional navigating the dating world. She repeatedly encounters someone at her gym. Initially, she barely notices them, but over time she begins to feel comfortable and drawn to them. The repeated exposure has subtly increased her liking, independent of conversation or shared interests. Her attraction isn't magical, it's psychological, a product of the mere exposure effect at work. Awareness of this effect doesn't diminish the feelings, but explains the invisible mechanics behind them. The effect also plays a role in workplace dynamics. Familiar colleagues, even if unremarkable initially, tend to be trusted more, consulted more frequently, and preferred for collaboration simply due to repeated interactions. Leaders who maintain consistent visibility gain subtle influence over teams, not necessarily through overt authority, but through the quiet power of familiarity. The mere exposure effect can also influence habits and learning. Repeated exposure to information, skills, or routines increases comfort and acceptance. For instance, a student repeatedly reviewing difficult material may initially dislike it, but gradually grow more comfortable and confident. A new exercise routine may feel daunting at first, but becomes enjoyable as exposure increases. Repetition transforms resistance into preference. Interestingly, the effect also extends to abstract concepts and ideas. Repeatedly encountering a political slogan, philosophical idea, or even a scientific principle increases perceived credibility and attractiveness. This is why slogans are repeated in campaigns and ideas are reinforced in education. Familiarity creates a mental shortcut. The brain equates repeated exposure with validity and safety. However, there's an ethical dimension to consider. The same psychological principle can be exploited to manipulate preferences, decisions, or behavior. Repeated exposure can create attachment or trust, even in the absence of substance. This underscores the importance of awareness. By understanding the mere exposure effect, you can recognize when your preferences are being subtly shaped and make deliberate, conscious choices rather than reflexive ones. Practical applications are powerful. Self-presentation. If you want to be perceived positively in social or professional settings, consistent visibility, attending meetings, networking, showing up, can subtly increase likability and trust. Marketing and branding. Repetition of core messages, visuals, or brand touchpoints creates subconscious preference, leveraging the power of familiarity. Personal habits. Gradual repeated exposure to new routines, ideas, or skills increases comfort and adoption, turning initially uncomfortable practices into lasting habits. Relationships. Spending time with people consistently fosters trust, comfort, and positive regard, demonstrating the subtle power of repeated interaction. The mere exposure effect also intersects with modern technology. Algorithms on social media, streaming platforms, and news aggregators exploit this principle to shape preferences. The more you see certain content, the more you like it, reinforcing engagement loops and shaping behavior at scale. Awareness of this mechanism allows you to navigate digital spaces more intentionally, avoiding passive influence and maintaining control over your choices. At its core, the effect reveals a simple truth about human psychology. Our brains are wired to favor familiarity over novelty, safety over risk, repetition over randomness. This wiring has profound consequences for decision-making, preferences, and influence. It explains why some ideas catch on while others fade, why we are drawn to familiar faces, and why repeated exposure transforms ambivalence into attraction. Even in personal development, the principle holds. Exposure to positive habits, affirmations, and knowledge gradually shifts perception and behavior. By intentionally surrounding yourself with beneficial stimuli, books, mentors, routines, or environments, you harness the mere exposure effect to reinforce growth and achievement. In conclusion, the mere exposure effect is a silent architect of human preference. It operates quietly, unconsciously, and relentlessly, shaping decisions, attractions, and behaviors. By recognizing it, you gain insight into how your mind forms attachments, trust, and liking, and how repeated exposure can be leveraged ethically to improve relationships, learning, and personal development. Next time you find yourself inexplicably drawn to something, ask, is it truly superior, or is it simply familiar? Awareness transforms the invisible power of repetition from manipulation into mastery, giving you control over what you value, trust, and choose in a world overflowing with stimuli.